West Coast, the East Coast, and deep in the heart of Texas, it's the Geek at Arms podcast with Brian, Mike, and James.
Greetings, friends, and welcome once again to the Geek at Arms podcast. Alas, James can't be with us today due to some overwhelming difficulties on his end. He's less deep in the heart of Texas and more deep in the heart of Hoth, I think. So the MC duty falls to me. I'm Brian, and with me, as usual, is Mike, and we also have with us a guest. Allow me to introduce Dr. Ken Mondschein, a professor of medieval and Renaissance studies, historical fencing master and translator and author of several books, including Fencing, a Renaissance treatise by Camilla Agrippa, The Knightly Art of Battle, The Art of the Rapier, Art of the Two-Handed Sword, among others. So how are you today, Ken?
I'm just fine. I'm here, eager to talk to you guys. I'm trying to be very, very perky, even though I'm trying to... All right, I'm lying. I'm not okay. It's not okay. It's just, I'm not doing okay at all. I'm trying to learn Java. Geez.
That'll do it.
Very geeky activity. I'm like classes and objects. And the thing, I'm doing a master's in education. And one thing I'm learning is that coding is not often taught at all well because, we learn by doing. Mm-hmm. So, but aside from Java.
Have you done any programming before?
A little bit. Coding. I mean, I do websites, do my own websites. I did BASIC in high school, things like that. I kind of know how coding works, but everything's its own language and sort of the grammar, like, okay, classes and objects and calling objects and all of this, it's some sort of Kabbalah that I just need to kind of beat into my brain. So I'm better at Latin. I'm better at Latin, quite frankly. So
well, Latin's more well organized than Java. So
well, the thing with Java, and this is something that kind of applies to a lot of subjects for people who don't code, is that sometimes words mean things in a technical sense in a particular discipline that makes people on the outside scratch their heads and say, what does that mean? What is that? And you kind of have to reinscribe what words mean. And that can be a problem for understanding in a lot of things, I think.
Well, and also with my understanding of Latin, I mean, I only took a few years of it in high school, but if you didn't put in a certain punctuation mark, it didn't make the rest of the page disappear. So it's just a little difference.
Absolutely true. Lord knows that. Yeah, maybe it's why I prefer manuscripts. Sigh.
Well, why not get to Renaissance Italian? They don't much like punctuation there anyway, do they?
Molto bene. No, it's just long, drawn-out sentences. Much prefer the Renaissance Italian.
Well, what about you, Mike? How are you doing today?
I am doing pretty okay. Yeah. There's not much of a story behind that, but, I'll take okay over. Let's take James, for example. I'm doing a lot better than he is right now.
Right.
It's like, you know what? We get 20-degree weather here in Boston, and we're fine. It freezes over for weeks on end. We're fine. We happen to somehow have the infrastructure for that. We're fine.
Yeah, well,
Texas is a little different.
Yeah, well, knife fights over parking spots in Southie, but yeah, that's...
Oh gosh, yeah.
But I live out west. We have all the places to put the snow. So, like, where are we going to put the snow? Where won't we put the snow? We've got every place to put the snow. Students, we don't have any students right now. Just put it in the dorms. We don't care. So.
Boston is still not over the winter of 2014, 2015. When we had just nor'easter after nor'easter, and the question of where do we put the snow? Just in the city, we ran out of options. And there was one moment in the middle of a blizzard, my wife was trying to throw the snow up on top of the snow pile, but the wind would catch it, and she didn't have the height or the strength to actually get the snow up on top, and it would just kind of fall back down to where she was shoveling it. And she just put down the shovel, started crying, and went on inside. Like, don't worry, the 6-foot people can handle this. This is okay.
Didn't they wind up dumping it in the bay? I mean, they just like repurposed the duck boats or something.
Oh, they actually thought about it. And the fact that they had spent so much time cleaning up the harbor made it a really big deal, because those snowbanks are not pristine. I mean, there are there are things in them when they melt. I mean, car bumpers, bicycles, cups, underwear, everything. Why? I don't understand why the underwear was in the snowbank, but there it was. And you don't want to dump that stuff into the harbor. So they instead made melting farms, where, we had one by our house that was an old construction site that was not used anymore. And that pile of snow lasted until mid-May, and another one lasted until early July. So they were looking for outlets.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you do find the hat that my girlfriend knit for me in one of those snowbanks, please let me know. I've been looking for it. I don't know. Or my gloves. Jeez, I lose everything. So
I'm feeling like now we should have like a museum of snowbank artifacts just to preserve this sort of thing for posterity. How's winter treating you, Brian?
Yeah, how you doing, Brian?
Is it
was
70
a little
degrees
windy. Right. It was a little windy this week. That's about all of it.
Where are you?
I'm in Los Angeles.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh,
land of no weather at all.
No, you just have one season: traffic and fire. I'm sorry, fire's also a season.
Yeah,
traffic and fire. That's about it. Yeah.
All right. So shall we head on into Geek Out?
Oh yes,
Let's shall. As is our tradition, we give you first crack at that, Ken. What have you been geeking out to lately?
Oh, geez, like I've got time with the Java. No, what do I like? I don't know if you guys have mentioned this on the show before, but there's a webcomic I really, really dig, Kill 6 Billion Demons. I don't think it gets enough credit or press. It's kind of amazing. It's this weird martial arts alternative universe. It's like really good. It's like a kung fu movie meets Roger Zelazny's Nine Princes in Amber meets I don't even know what, but it's definitely worth checking out.
That sounds really cool.
So
I've heard that title before, but I've never gone looking for it.
It's kill6billiondemons.com. And then the other webcomic I love reading is Girl Genius, but everyone knows Girl Genius, so I won't. Do we need to give them more probably? Yeah. All right. Read Girl Genius to you. I'm always looking for good web comics because I really like procrastinating. So.
Well, have you read Atomic Robo? That's another one we like a lot.
No, I should check that out.
Nuclear-powered robot built by Nikola Tesla leads a team of action scientists in defending the world. It's a lot of fun.
Cool.
Very humorous.
I think I read an introduction to collected works of Nikola Tesla once. I've always liked him. Huh? Did I get paid for that? I don't remember. Anyway.
Every time we drop his name on the podcast, we get a nickel from the Tesla Foundation. So we'll pass it on to you.
Oh, good. Excellent. Cool.
How about you, Brian? What have you been geeking out to?
Oh, well, my computer lost its GPU lately. So I dug out this old loaner PC that I've got, and it's just got a Pentium processor in it. So I went looking through my Steam library thinking, okay, what can I run on a Pentium? And I ran across XCOM Enemy Unknown, which is from 2003, 2005, something like that. It's like, I can run that one, barely. So I've been playing a lot of XCOM lately. If you're not familiar with this, it's a turn-based small unit tactical game. You've got a small squad of soldiers, 4 to 6 guys. You move and you shoot, and then the aliens take their turn, and you're defending the Earth against an alien invasion. And it's got a layer of resource gathering and strategy. So you upgrade your gear and you expand your base. I really like a turn-based game because I'm not real fast. My mind isn't as nimble as it needs to be for a real-time strategy. So if I try to play StarCraft or something, I just get overrun. But in a turn-based game, I have all the time in the world to think and calculate probabilities, and I do really well with those. I enjoy it quite a lot. And it had been several years since the last time I played XCOM, so it's been nice to get back into that and to have something I can actually run on this dinosaur of a computer.
Oh, I remember playing. I loved that game as a kid. I used to play.
Yeah, I played the first two when I was young, also XCOM and then Terror from the Deep. And they got rid of the most annoying parts of, okay, now I have to equip my squad every time they go out and laboriously drag weapons onto them and grenades and stuff. Like, Now they remember what they're supposed to pick up in the squad room, so you don't have to do that every time.
And so this Enemy Unknown, this was the one before they went to they went to a first-person shooter for a while, didn't they?
There was I think it was like
an over-the-shoulder third person, maybe.
I think there was one, and then there was also a kind of a flight simulator called XCOM Interceptor, while you're flying the interceptor ship that shoots down the aliens. And then they released XCOM 2, which is actually the fifth in the series, because the two early ones, it's all very confusing which titles belong to which game, and trying to figure out, okay, which one is the first one? I want to play the first one.
So was it done by Microsoft? Because that seems to how they name their consoles.
I honestly remember it's 2K Games that did that one.
Well, sorry, yeah. Microsoft, XCOM did it first.
I'm sure that they don't have the last word on that either. Several games where I've been confused about where to start, and trying to figure out which episode of Steins Gate to watch first was also difficult.
Yeah, I had to hit the Wikipedia to decide, well, where do I start reading Mouse Guard? So.
Oh yeah. So what about you, Mike? What's been on your geek plate lately?
Most recently, I have picked up an anime independently, all on my own, which is not something I usually do. And it was because I was actually looking for another one, got misdirected in a translation, and didn't realize that something was a video game instead of an actual anime, just because I liked the art. And I landed right smack dab in the middle of Restaurant to Another World. And this has the most ridiculous, formulaic presentation of an idea, and I don't care. It is the general premise is there's this restaurant that is open 5 days a week, and it serves a normal clientele. It's in Japan, but it serves a Western fusion food. And on Saturdays, it's closed, or at least it seems to be, because on Saturdays, it's hosting an entirely different clientele. Because on Saturdays, there are doors to this restaurant that appear all over this alternate dimension fantasy world. And the show is almost every episode is exactly the same. And that is, some creature or character finds that this door has mystically appeared in front of them. And so they realize that there is magic at work and something sinister happening. So they steal their courage and they turn that knob and they pull the door open, ready to face whatever might be on the other side, which is a waitress asking them to take a table and telling them that water and a menu will be there shortly. The character has some moment of confusion but complies, and then sees a strange list of foods that they have never seen in their lives before. Nothing like what is available on their world. And then they take one bite, and their eyes grow wide, and they gasp at this new flush of sensations, and it becomes their favorite dish. And then we do this again in 20 minutes. And you would think that would get really, really old, but it doesn't. I mean, they change it up just enough each time. Like there's one time this warrior culture encounters this door, and they have to develop a ritual in order to what they say the magic spell for the food, which is they don't understand the language, so they're trying to phonetically memorize. Yes, I would like to order katsu and rice, which is the spell to make the things appear. And what they wind up getting served is basically like a Japanese household's like peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Like it's like the real quick, throw it together and give it to the children, which becomes their honored dish. So it's funny, it's amusing, and I think it's hitting me right. One thing that it hits for me is something that I really, really miss in this pandemic, and that is cooking for my friends, because I love having my friends come in and say, oh, have you tried this? Let's do this. Let's make this. And I get to experience something new, or I'm cooking and being host for people in my home and serving them something they haven't had before, or that I know that they really, really love. And so it's just kind of reminding me of that emotional tenor which I really dig. So yay for hopefully the end of the pandemic sometime in the future.
If you can get over the etchy of it, you might enjoy Food Wars, which is pretty much the same thing, except that when they take a bite of the food, it's so wonderful their clothes explode.
Wow.
Yes.
It's anime?
Yeah.
That's Food Wars. Food Wars is the explosive clothes.
Right.
And my wife and I had said to our friend who suggested Food Wars to us, we said, hey, there's this anime. It's about food, and everyone stays clothed. So,
yeah.
With a small disclaimer, there is in Restaurant to Another World, there is a dragon that does transform into a woman and then puts the clothes on because because apparently you have to have that at least in 2 episodes for a food oriented anime.
Yeah, I mean, fan service is, yeah, it's anime. I mean, please, yeah, well.
And problematic. Problematic.
Yeah,
I'll say it.
Yeah. What I miss is, I brew. I like doing medievally brewing experiments. My girlfriend has bees. And I like making mead and cider. I live in an apple producing region, so I just go with a few carboys for the orchard. So I have about 14, 15 cases of things I've made in the basement that, normally they get drunk at like medieval events. Well, there were no medieval events last summer, and I've been very bored and stuck inside, and I have a lot of alcohol in the basement, so it's gonna be well aged. Anyway, sorry,
it's funny because I do brewing, but of a lot more short term, which I do like ginger beers and similars. So all you have to do is just brew it and then add the yeast and wait 2 or 3 days, and there you go. And I can give it to my kids for about a week or maybe a little bit more if you don't leave it in the sun too long. But I actually wound up finding flavor combinations and other weird stuff. You get bored, and trying to do my own butterbeer, which was actually kind of a lot of fun, trying to get imaginary flavors and then serve it to my friends. Yeah, like nobody knows what butterbeer tastes like, but this is what I imagine, so here's what I'm going to put together. And I did have the joy of giving it to a friend who's like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what I was thinking it was like in the book. So
I always thought it tasted like Dr. Brown's cream soda, but that's me. So
yeah, I actually put some butterscotch flavoring into it, some caramel flavoring, and cream soda flavoring. And I experimented with a whole bunch of other things. So I was like, no, this tastes right to me, and this tastes good. So let's try this. So yeah, nobody's wrong here. It's just, how does this imaginary flavor that they never tell you what it tastes like appear in your imagination? So it's kind of fun. And also what I've been geeking out to is Hilda Season 2. If you might notice that some of my TV watching is lighthearted and kind of fluffy, that's because it kind of is. And I'm going to stand by that decision right now. So Hilda, for those of you who haven't experienced the show, is about a young girl who grew up in the wilderness and has all sorts of incredible experiences with the local wildlife. Birds, trees, trolls, giants, it's flying wolf ball things. So the normal sort of thing that you would see in sort of a Nordish-inspired mythic world. And it's also juxtaposed with kind of an urban everyday life because she moves into the city. And this city life, it coexists in the same world as these sort of mythic elements. But those are the things that are over there. We try to keep as much of that out in the city as we can. And she continues to pursue those more mythic aspects even in her urban life. And it's a wonderful show. It has just a wonderful spirit to it. She kind of reminds me of the 10th Doctor in if you watch Doctor Who, in terms of her beholding of the wonder and danger of these beautiful, beautiful creatures that might kill her. But that's kind of beside the point until it's exactly the point and you need to run away very fast. So we were enjoying season 2 until it hit a cliffhanger ending at the end of the season. Well, it was right around Christmas that we were really binging the show, and I had happened to give my wife the graphic novels, the number 5, Hilda and the Stone Forest, and the number 6, Hilda and the Mountain King. And I bought these two because I knew that they weren't in the show until season 2 came out, and it turned out that number 5 was in the show, but the show ended with the graphic novel number 5. And it just so happened to turn out that I gave her here is the resolution to that cliffhanger. So it was at least kind of fun to say, okay, oh my gosh, how is this going to end? And then, oh, well, here it is. This is different. This is a different media, and it sets up slightly differently, but it's still both are very satisfying in their own media.
It sounds fascinating. Really, really like a take on something that like you don't really, I haven't really heard of before. It's really hard, if you think about it, for something really new and original. A lot of stuff in fantasy and otherwise is just, it's like the same thing you've seen before, but just with something slightly different. This sounds, well, really original. It
really does have a special flavor to it. I mean, urban fantasy has been done, and juxtaposing mythology into the commonplace has been done, but it's just such a different tone to it this time. And especially if you have it geared towards kids, it usually has this ramshackled together, very clumsy mythology that is just pieced together from fairy tales and other mythology that we've read. This really feels like it is a mythology built for this world, and it's probably been inspired by 100,000 things, but it's woven together very well, and it feels new and it feels original.
Cool.
And that'll wrap it up for my geek out.
Well, then, I think that means it's time to address ourselves to our main topic, and that is Ken's book, On Time, A History of Western Timekeeping.
Yeah, it's a thing.
It is a thing that we, in fact, read.
Yeah. Yes. Wow. When you contacted us, of course, Mike and James were flipping their lids, getting the chance to talk to you.
You weren't. Brian's the level-headed one. We all know.
Well, I'm not. I'm not so much into the fencing as they are. The sword work isn't something I've ever gotten into. So this is actually the first of your work that I've read. And I thought, oh, okay, well, hey, Ken Mondschein, that's cool. I know you guys are real fans. He wants to talk about time. Okay. It's like, is there something to do with time and fencing? No, he's just talking about clocks. Okay, cool. Well, and so I actually got a little more excited about that because I've got this soft spot for engineering and history. So I was tickled about, oh, okay, great. We're going to have this guy on, and I'm actually going to have something to say, maybe.
Well, and it's funny because you say about the history of the engineering, because as I was reading through chapter 3, we'll get more into it, but talking about all of the technological developments and the technical improvements and the descriptions of all of these moving pieces, I really wanted to take chapter 3 into a clock museum with me, just so I could see examples of these things. And it turns out that there is a pretty good clock museum in Pennsylvania. So, it's not exactly meeting in the middle, Brian, but maybe we can meet up there. We'll take chapter 3 there, and we'll just take a look at what they've got once this, whole pandemic thing.
I've got family in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
Oh, this got a little bit more real.
Whoa. Oh,
Ken, do you want a road trip?
Yeah, sure. I got to check out some horses. I don't know. I might be jousting in Ohio. My cousin's in Wilkes-Barre, Penzig's in Pittsburgh or near Pittsburgh. Yeah, I'm in Pennsylvania a lot. Mostly it takes a long time to drive through is my feelings about Pennsylvania.
Oh, that's so true.
But
we're both from Kansas, and that's kind of the definition of that state.
Well, Texas is definitely.
Texas takes a long time to drive through, yes.
Yeah, but actually, there's the thing about it is that it was actually fencing that got me interested in time and timekeeping, because it's not just about clocks. I mean, clocks are just sort of the tip of the iceberg, but why clocks? Why clocks in Western culture? Why are clocks sort of privileged? And ideas of time in fencing treatises and intellectual conceptions of time, and how clocks affected how we think. And sort of one thing I really like to do is just sort of question why we think what we think. And, I tried to do that with this, just sort of defamiliarize things that we just take for granted.
It's interesting. It's one of the things that attracted me to the historical treatises of fencing, because I didn't really start studying them until after I got hurt. I had a hamstring injury, and so I haven't actually been fencing for a while. But I was like, okay, while I'm recovering, let's just really take this opportunity to study the treatises. And then I started seeing so much more behind the work, that it wasn't just, how do I take this slender piece of steel and put it into that guy over there? There's a lot that's going on in the prevailing philosophy that's influencing this work. There's a lot of pedagogical shifts between the medieval age and the Renaissance age, and that's even a really broad brushstroke and very reductionist, but still. There's a lot of intellectual mechanics going on behind the work that made it more interesting when I knew that I couldn't actually put this into place. And so it's really what got me interested in the study, and I was so pleased to see so much of that preserved, or I should say highlighted in this work. And we should probably remind our listeners that we have a lot of underlying assumptions and cultural drives in terms of not only how do we tell time, but why do we tell time? And I think that was so fascinating to see that highlighted in this book.
Yeah. I mean, and you're right, too, about what you said before about fencing books changing from the medieval to the early modern, and who's your audience, right? And are you trying to tell a third person? And in the same way, timekeeping and our means of telling time are communicative, right? That we're coordinating with other people. So there's a big difference between saying, okay, I'll see you when the sun reaches its zenith, at noon, versus, I'll see you at 3 p.m. And these things haven't remained static and constant. One thing we often do is we think that things are, either that history is teleological, that the way it's done now or the way it's done in our culture is the best way of doing things, and it's the only right way of doing things, right? Or, we just kind of ignore everything else, right? It's either teleological, and I forgot where I was going with that, so it's okay. But either things are getting to a point where it's inevitable. The sense of inevitability about how things became how they are, and there really is nothing inevitable about it.
I think that's also something that you highlighted in the book, is that when we talk about this, and if we talk very broadly about relying on, we have the zodiac to measure seasons. I shouldn't say to measure seasons, but we correlate the zodiac with these seasons, or we have made a sundial, so we have some marker for the passage of the sun, to we have a water clock, to a clock tower, to this thing on my wrist that tells me what time it is and maybe that I should get up and move. And also these satellites in the sky using timekeeping to tell me where I am as I move about the neighborhood. That this isn't progress, that we see development. And I thought that was a really important reminder that this isn't driving to some teleos. This isn't driving to the ultimate end, that this is the best that we are experiencing. This isn't the pinnacle or reaching toward a pinnacle of humanity. as we see development over time.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing that you mentioned, I'll draw again the parallel with fencing, that the Victorians, like Alfred Hutton, right? They saw things of their own day as the ultimate development, and we do still have that discourse, don't we? That we've got that modernity is better. You can see in all sorts of movies. Think of I love citing Army of Darkness, where
Oh yeah.
Ash comes out and Ryan's like, "Listen up, you medieval screwheads. This is my boomstick." And and then I always ask classes, "Well, how would you make a shotgun in the Middle Ages?" And there's a sort of the Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court trope, where someone goes back in time and kind of invents the AK-47 in the 14th century, but which is, as we know, ridiculous, because all developments are contingent. There's two things that are needed. One, of course, is a perceived need: greater social coordination, greater ease of experimentation for scientists. The idea that this is something, and geekiness really comes in there too, sometimes just for the hell of it, right? Just because you're interested in a thing. But aside from perceived need, there's also the ability to realize what you want to do. In order to make a mechanical clock, you need to be able to smelt iron. If you're going to have iron parts that are not going to wear out as quickly as wood parts, that in order to make that, Ash's shotgun, you need to be able to make nitrocellulose powder and fairly pure steel, which required the Bessemer process. You need a lot of different things in order to come up with really any mechanical or technological process. And so it's one thing building on another. And we really also seem to like the idea of the lone genius. This whole idea of Leonardo da Vinci is the genius who could see more and further than other people. It's a bit of a misnomer. It's a bit difficult. So which was the John Harrison, right? I handled this in chapter 4, right? That Davis Oval wrote this book about John Harrison and his ocean-going chronometer. But the thing is, we could not have had the ocean-going chronometer without a whole lot of other developments. And in fact, the final model that really, really worked was basically just using the best watch technology of the day with some of Harrison's innovations. Yeah, but it also required other people working together in order to create this thing that actually worked. And we can point to that with really, really anything and everything. But Nobel Prizes aren't awarded to teams; they're awarded to one or two people, Watson and Crick. Never mind that they built on a female scientist whose name slips my mind. Built on her discoveries. Everything we do is sort of standing on the shoulders of giants.
And I think it's also important that you had mentioned that this is also in response of perceived need. Because if we had, this is purely speculative, of course, but let's just say that you take this ocean-going chronometer and you take it back in time 1,000 years. And would that have been beheld as anything more than an idle curiosity? Because there wasn't that need. B, the entire structures that would make keeping time important or having the accuracy of time so important just wouldn't have existed. And I think it's one of those things that we like to have this fantasy of the Yankee in King Arthur's court. Well, if I could go back in time, I would be a god among men. Or would they just think that you're an idiot? What do you mean I should wash my hands before doing surgery, you idiot? I'm a gentleman. My hands are always clean. And then going forward.
Yeah, and exactly. And you wouldn't have the survival skills that they might take for granted too. How do you build a fire, without matches? Just to say, the most obvious thing. So we are products, and this is one thing that kind of like the whole kind of reenactment thing too, that we can never truly be people of the past, right? We can kind of enact a sort of sympathetic magic. We can't actually fence like the people of the past because we're modern people with modern bodies and modern backgrounds. And we can't, truly be a medieval knight because we are, we're modern people who are doing things in modern ways for modern reasons. And we can't ever escape our context. It's just impossible.
And since we're here on the subject of reenactment and we can't do it perfectly, I'll just go ahead and put this out here for your comment. I know that I'm completely opening myself up unscripted here, but people have asked me like, oh, are you, so you're fencing just like they did back in the day? And I'd say, well, look, this is more like playing Jurassic Park than it is playing like a Renaissance person of some birth who would be trained. Because what we're doing is we're taking the dino DNA that we have of these manuscripts and these texts, and we're reading them through the lens that we have, but we're missing so many gaps. And so what we're doing is we're filling in those gaps in the dino DNA with frog DNA, which is our own modern concepts of reading what this means to us, reading in also some of the kinesiology from boxing or martial arts or tennis or modern fencing. And so what you have is you don't have an actual dinosaur. You have a modern reproduction that, as best we can tell, fits that skeleton. So I'll open that up for your comment.
But life finds a way. No, sorry. Yeah. Greg Melley, I think, first used the was the first one who used like the frog DNA metaphor for hemo. For me, it's a little different too. Is that we're doing it? I mean, the entire context. We have to look at the social context, right? Two things. One, I'm going to get a little Platonic on you in a sec, or maybe a little Hegelian, but. It's that we're doing it in a modern context for modern reasons. We have modern ideas of sport, ideas of what sword fighting should look like has been shaped by the movies. We use masks, we use safety equipment. We maybe do things that are more risky than they would do. Where we come up with modern games and scoring systems, and we do things in entirely different contexts, and that influences it too. And then, of course, also, even if we can kind of understand what they're saying, right? There's a lot that they don't say or they can't say because there's only so many things you can put in a book, right? I tried to write down everything I know in a book, and then, I'm always thinking, oh, there's this other thing that, comes to mind, or this thing or that thing that I also know, and it's up to everybody to sort of make the bones come to life, to breathe, to breathe life into those dry bones, which is actually another book I did on recreations, but in a way of doing it. But just in the same way, right? The mead I made can't be medieval mead because, well, there's Japanese knotweed in the backyard, and the bees foraged that, and that wasn't in medieval Europe. But at the same time, right? I do feel that there are always certain universals, right? That the universals of fencing cannot change. Things like distance and time and timing. And that we can, in many ways, understand what they mean, at least on an intellectual basis, because there are some commonalities of intellectual understanding as opposed to embodied understanding that can be put down. So even if we, the body in some ways is a trap, right? We can't escape the fact that we are embodied, but we can't change the fact that we live in the material world. But on a certain transcendental level, we can, I think, achieve, at least in some things, an intellectual understanding. But we need to know understand the language. So, which is timekeeping. and that's why I wrote my doctoral dissertation on timekeeping, because I like defense. So.
All right. Well, before we get too far into this, I want to give some note to something that James and I had been talking about before. Unfortunately, it was clear that he would not be able to continue to participate. And he had said that he really likes things to be orderly and neat and tidy, and all the categories just line up so nicely. But our contemporary understanding of time is really an abstraction, and even so much as not knowing exactly how long a day is was really he said that it was really driving him nuts. Is we have this lunar day, the sidereal day, the solar day, and none of them line up together, and none of them make anything that's neat, tidy, and orderly for us to not have to have these extra days or extra hours or extra minutes plugged in there to make everything fit. He said that just drove me nuts. And I also thought it was kind of a fun note to read in this book.
Yeah. Well, we don't really have lunar days. The moon measures months, but the difference between the sidereal day and the mean solar day, it's not actually all that crazy making if you just remember that the day is whatever we say the day is. It's just what are we going to measure it by? Because before we had really, really accurate clocks, it was pretty simple. And in fact, it was universal and neat, because in the Middle Ages, they did like things to be neat. And they said, oh, well, a day is one revolution of the heavenly sphere, that at the point when the stars go all the way around 360 degrees and come back to the point where they are, so say, pick a point, pick that church steeple over there, pick a star that's lined up with the point of the church steeple. When that star revolves back to where it was, then that's one day. And that seemed to them to be the most absolute thing they could think of. Actually, they didn't measure it by the stars. They measured it by the sphere beyond the stars, that there's the outermost heavenly sphere, right? The unmoved mover, the thing closest to God in the medieval worldview. But the stars are, since you can't see that, you just have to go by the stars, right? And it's got a 1-to-1 ratio to the stars. So that, for the longest time, was the most absolute thing they can have. And they did have this idea of the absolute astronomical time. But the thing is that the Earth also goes around the sun. And because the Earth goes around the sun, the Earth, of course, it spins on its axis, which is the day, but it has to spin just a little bit more to catch up, because every day it goes, 1/365th and 1/4 way or around the sun. So it's got to spin just a little bit more. So the way that astronomers redefined the day, once they had accurate enough clocks to determine that there was a difference between the two, was by the mean solar day, basically the average of the day, right? And they call this the mean solar day. And it's really not that far off of the sidereal day. It's just more accurate. And that's kind of one of the big themes in the history of timekeeping, is the growth of accuracy and precision. But it's not that we're lost without reference. It's just once you really, really examine what the reference are, then you question, okay, what's the best way to measure it? And you can measure it even more finely. And that makes it, if anything, I think a little more sure, because it's even more accurate. So hopefully James is feeling okay about that.
I think he's feeling a lot better about that than he is about other things. So yeah. we've got that much to take comfort in. Yeah. But no, I think that it becomes a lot more, it becomes a lot more clear throughout the text, rather than just looking at the numbers of this is how long it takes for this period of time and this period of time. But of course, the how long does this take is rooted in a very particular perspective, which is very much tied up in this thing that I have on my wrist.
To us, at least, right? Not to Galileo.
Right. Exactly. I think that might also be one thing this might be a good jumping point for us to talk about the fact that we should give this heads up to our listeners. I know this is going to be a huge surprise. Just get ready, buckle your seatbelts. Humanity's regard for time has changed a lot over the last, couple thousand years. So, we've had differences of reasons of why we would even bother to pick a point of reference. I think that we can probably just kind of ease in and talk a little bit about about Aristotle's concept of time and timing and his reference for time, because that becomes pretty important not only for the ancient world, but it comes right back around in the Renaissance.
So we can't, I mean, we need to really have two different things here. We have the social use of time, the perceived need for timekeeping, and then we have the theorization of time. So let's go back to the ancient world. So the Greeks, they had all the Babylonians' knowledge, they had the Egyptians' knowledge, and they had sundials. And time, though, in the ancient world was measured by not by clock so much as by moving things, if that makes sense. Which isn't to say they didn't have abstract measurements like the Olympiads and stuff, but they had. The Romans, for instance, were much more interested in what we might call event markers. So the best example of where we get our AM and PM from is you couldn't plead cases in the Roman Forum, law cases, after the sun had reached the meridian. That is, afternoon. So meaning solar noon. So they had antemeridian before noon and PM post meridian after the afternoon. The Romans brought after they conquered Sicily, they brought from, I believe it was Syracuse, a sundial to Rome. But if you know anything about sundials, they only are calibrated to work at a certain latitude. So they didn't really care. It was war booty. They didn't care. It didn't keep accurate time. But for the longest time, right, time was measured and can only be known by reference to moving things. And that's what Aristotle says. What Aristotle says about that reflects his physical reality, that time is the number of the motion with respect to the before and after. That is, we know time passes, and this is very psychological too, right? This is entirely psychological, and this passes into Christian thought. I'll talk about Christianity in a moment, but this passes into Christian thought through such thinkers as Augustine. But what Aristotle is saying by this, the number of motion with respect to the before and after, is that time is a quantity. And it's not a number like you and I might think about it as an integer, but rather he means it's something more akin to a ratio, that it's something that can be divided, more like geometry. Think of Euclid, for instance, and say Euclid bisecting a line. So the before and the after, how we measure time relatively. How much time has passed? Well, the sun has come and gone. It's been one day. The stars have revolved around, right? It's been one sidereal day. The shadow has moved this much on the sundial. It's been that much time. The water has run out of the water clock, the clepsydra. Oh, it's been that much time. Timekeeping is therefore, or time is eminently relative, right? It's essentially more like using natural phenomena for a stopwatch, if you would. Though the idea, of course, of the sidereal day, the revolution of the stars, always gives us sort of an absolute measure. But even that is a convention. And St. Augustine talks about this. Well, how long was a day when God stopped the sun in Jericho, right? He uses that example. Or if you fall asleep or you go under anesthesia, right? It's kind of lost time. We only know the passage of time through moving things. And this begins to change. And the biggest thing that really changes, I think, in the West, and the real departure, was Christianity in a few ways. First thing, it took some getting there, but Christianity is a religion that takes place in time. It is eminently historical, right? And I should also talk about books and codices with this and scrolls. So in Judaism, right, we've got the Torah, right? And that we read the Torah, we read our Parsha every week. And then at the end, Torah, we basically rewind it, right? It's a scroll. The Codex, which comes in there, along with Christianity, though not entirely unrelated, though kind of a separate phenomenon, is different. You can open a Codex, you can open the Bible to any page you want. Right? You can open to, boom. Okay, it's the Exodus from Egypt. Oh, turn back. Oh, it's the flood. Oh, go ahead. Oh, and there's now Jesus is preaching, right? If you open any Bible, right? And Also, one thing that Christianity inherited from Judaism is that it is a religion that takes place in time. It is teleological, that in the beginning, God created the world, right? That there's a fall, and that then Jesus comes to redeem humanity, and then at the end, there's going to be judgment. So humanity's history is kind of bookended. And because of this, of course, eventually we got the, what we now call Common Era, before the Common Era dating, right? But of course, originally it was AD and, BC. And it divides time essentially into eras. And dating from when, I think it was Dionysius Exegesis, dated the incarnation, at year 0. So Christianity takes place in time, but also Christianity, so that's the bigger term, right? That's historical time. The Codex itself also does that. So, for instance, Eusebius, something called Eusebian tables. Well, there's 4 gospels, or at least 4 canonical gospels, right, after Nicaea and everything. Then, well, how do we, we can reconcile and cross-read between those, so they actually came up with tables to show that. And of course, you can skip around between the 4 gospels, which in many ways is seeing with God's eye, right? Because God, being outside of the universe of moving things and therefore outside time, can see all things, right? That's how Calvin, well, I won't get into predestination. That's getting off my subject, right? So that's getting off topic. Okay. But books, and fencing books too, right? Fencing books are devices for seeing all possible times, right? So we'll talk about that in a little bit. That gets into it. But you can't understand fencing books unless you understand all this kind of backstory. So Christianity, to get back to other topic, also puts times for prayer on us. That I rise up to praise thee in the middle of the night. This is put down in canons, in the Benedictine rule, times for prayer, and it necessitates actually keeping fairly good track of times, which was of course done mostly through event markers in the early Middle Ages after the astronomical, and talking here, of course, in Western Europe, because of course the Muslim world never lost this knowledge. They didn't privilege it the way the West did, but they never lost it. But the being able to precisely calculate time using things like astrolabes is really only reintroduced in the 10th century or so from the Arabic speaking world. But nonetheless, there is this mandate in Christianity to keep prayer times, and these were of course reckoned relatively using seasonal hours, which are simply you divide the periods of light and dark into 12 each, and they shrink and grow as the seasons change. But you still need this sort of proportional division, but you still need to keep track of time. And it's from this, right, where a clock's located, well, in church towers, for a couple of reasons. One is that, of course, a clock that's weight driven needs a high tower for it to work, but also because it was, in many ways, the clergy who were in charge of marking the hours. And of course, as society was, in the past, fundamentally Christian, I would argue it still is, because of course, all of those Christian concepts have become secularized and passed into our, doesn't matter if you're Muslim or Jewish, you still get Christmas holidays, right? But
right.
This Christian idea of time becomes more and more precise, and leads in many ways to more and more precise timekeeping devices, and gets turned towards that. But also this idea that society should be regulated by such devices. To compare it, China also had them, but they found a system that worked for them. They used water clocks, and they stayed with it. In the Muslim world, there's this idea, very much an idea, that time markers should be understandable by everybody. There's a really an antipathy, in, as far as I've read, in a lot of Muslim theological writings, for anything not able to be understood by the vast majority of people. Whereas the West, and certainly prayer times are very important in Islam as well, but in the West there's this weird combination of having this privileged class of people who are in charge of timekeeping, and this idea of mechanizing the process. And it's these combined perceived needs which drive the contingent development, which leads eventually to modern timekeeping systems. So that's my piece on that. I think that, did I answer your question and where you're going with that?
Oh yeah. We're good. And I think it actually kind of casts a little bit and more like to kind of set up where we are and where we're going in terms of how do we from where we are and where we're going. I think that we should probably, we've mentioned fencing and we've mentioned timing, and I know that we have a few of our listeners that are interested in the historical fencing aspect of this, as you and I are. And there is this concept of tempo that is always in, I shouldn't say always, but is very much a part of the Italian fencing tradition. And I had taken the opportunity to look through some of my treatises. And I will take this moment to say, yes, I understand that some of you out there may be on, I mean, this isn't a marital issue, but, on my wife's side of this, to say, you have way too many fencing books and you have a fencing book problem. And my position in this is I don't have a fencing book problem. I have a very large fencing bookcase. And someday I'm going to die. And someone is going to have to sort through my estate, and that dude is going to have a fencing book problem because they have no idea what to do with this.
And that's why I have students, so someone can inherit my fencing books.
That's one of the things that somebody's like, wow, you're going to have to find, if you start to go, you're going to have to find a library that's interested. I'm like, yeah, I know. But we have this idea of tempo that appears so many times in especially the Italian fencing tradition. And one of the interesting things is tempo isn't defined the same way. Many of them are still relying on an Aristotelian foundation to discuss tempo, but they all have these nuanced definitions of what tempo is.
And I've heard you and James mention this concept of tempo in the past. I didn't butt in at the time to ask what you meant. I mean, I hear the term and I think it's about the best time to play my unsummoned card, but I suspect you're not probably talking about the same thing as we talk about in Magic the Gathering.
Maybe and maybe not. Because you speak Magic the Gathering better than I do, and I think I speak fencing a little bit better than you do. So let's tell me what this means in Magic the Gathering, and maybe there is some connection.
Well, usually when a Magic player is talking about tempo, it's a way of measuring when it's time to play your card. And I can cast, you play your monster, and I know it's going to be able to attack me next turn. So I could unsummon it immediately, get it off the board, so it's not going to be a problem for another turn. Or I could wait until it's actually attacking me, unsummon it then, and set you back 2 turns. And, do I play out all of my monsters as quickly as I can so I can make your life total go down really fast? I could do that, but then if you have something that's just going to wipe everything off the board, then I'm out of cards and you get to win the game. So it's just a matter of when do I move and the rate at which I do things in order to help me win the game.
I'm seeing a few parallels here.
Yeah. I'm seeing some parallels there, with the exception, of course, that Magic is a turn-based game, right? You go, I go, then you go, then I go, right? Whereas in fencing, it's you go, and then I go, then I go, and then I go, because we're bisecting think of those tempi as lines, but you can bisect them. So if imagine there's a Magic card that lets you, well, I'm sure there are Magic cards that let you play like another card. And then that makes, that may make things more complicated. But all of these, right? You wrote in the Google document, so we're just note for listeners where we have a common Google document. Some definitions of time from various treatises, like Agrippa doesn't really define tempo, but I write in there that he's using the Aristotelian concept of tempo, which he is. It's just understood. Capo Ferro, Fabris, Palladini, they try to make definitions of it, but they all really have that same common Aristotelian understanding that if Capo Ferro says tempo is when you do something against the opponent not doing something, against their stillness, well, not doing something is a tempo, because it's a breath of time, right? It's a length of time. If the opponent moves, whether it's coming towards you or extending their arm or even attacking, those are still tempi, right? Anything you do or don't do can be measured as a tempo. And if you are 2 steps out of distance, of course, you are 2 tempi out of distance, because each step is its own tempo. And if you are within distance, then what you do is going to be in tempo. And of course, some people say, well, why do we need to intellectualize this? And you don't. It's just, well, like anything else, you need a vocabulary to explain things to a person who's not there, right? To a person who is distant from you. Unlike, say, in the Middle Ages, you were talking about the change in rhetoric, and before about the change in rhetoric in fencing books. Well, in the Middle Ages, there are records of tuition that was given in person, but in the age of print, well, I could be writing for somebody whom I've never met. Today, of course, in the age of YouTube, it could be somebody whom I've never met too, but who could see me move on YouTube and understand it that way. But having a technical vocabulary, being able to understand stuff is kind of critical in order to be able to have a sensible treatise. Does that kind of make sense to you?
Yeah.
And I just kind of want to just highlight, if you really want to say something entirely maddening, when somebody says, well, why do you feel the need to over-intellectualize this? Say, oh, that's just what Docciolini said.
Yeah. Yeah.
He has a little quip in there to say, well, we're not going to talk about this in philosophical terms. We're only going to make this in terms of what is practical to our profession. And just kind of moves on. I'm like, well, thanks, Docciolini. We don't need that kind of negativity around. No, just kidding. Yeah. If we can pull something directly from the text, and I found this fascinating on page 106, for those of you listeners who are reading at home. Newton, who was a devout man, believed that the existence of time and space, rather than being independent of a divine being, proved God's immanence or permeation of the universe. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So basically, it's overthrowing the Aristotelian idea of time and space being relative and only knowable by moving things. In contrast, Newton said, no, time is absolute. It is unchanging, marching on. In a sense, it's a metric. Think of it like a computer clock, or really he's just applying a clock, some sort of great clock to the whole universe. And of course, with time goes space, because the two are correlated. And to him, this absolute time, this unchanging time, the fact that time goes on at a constant rate, no matter where you are, independent of any human observer, is proof of God's immanence, right? Because God is everywhere, God is all-knowing, and it's God's permeating the universe is what makes this possible. So for him, this concept in natural philosophy is proof of the existence of God, which is why everyone hated Einstein later. So. Yeah.
Well, and talking about God's ordering of the universe, also James kind of brought out in the previous episode that he was watching this television show called Tudor Monastery, which is just a reality TV show people who are either living in or trying to build or live as if they were living in a Tudor monastery. And one episode focused entirely on building a clock. And the reason why they were building a clock was only for the purpose of marking the hours of prayer. And it was one of those things that, we had said at the time, well, what other purpose would there be for a clock in a Tudor monastery but for marking the hours of prayer? I think this has a lot of correlations with a number of points in the book, actually.
Yeah, well, so how would such a clock work, right? It would have been, in Tudor times, it would have been a mechanical clock, perhaps less accurate than, a modern clock, but it would have been certainly a weight-driven mechanical clock. And they would have kept, though, both the seasonal hours. 16th century clocks kept both seasonal hours as relative hours, and you can do this, quite easily through gearing, and also the absolute hours, right, according to the sidereal day. In earlier times, they used water clocks because they're measuring more relatively. But of course, a mechanical clock, which is of course an independent phenomena, gives you a more accurate, perhaps more accurate or more precise way of looking at it. And of course, today prayer time, people still keep prayer times, and there's merely calibrated to the modern clock, though they still float somewhat, right? They still, for matins is always about dawn, and of course dawn moves according to the time of year.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said and they still do mark the hours of prayer. You can, if you're ever near Harvard Square, you can still hear the monastery bells as they are marking the hours of prayer for an Episcopal monastery that we have nearby. It's always kind of a fascinating thing. Just bicycling through the city, there is still this coexistence of these practices alongside of some of these modern conveniences in the contemporary world. Marking the hours of prayer while we also have our Fitbits and our GPSs, which I kind of found to be a wonderful irony the last time I heard the bells toll.
Yeah, or if you're in Europe, I lived in Paris, I was someplace on the Rive Gauche where the university used to be. You could hear the bells of Notre Dame really, really clearly, and really of any other churches. Venice is a veritable cacophony, but this is before Notre Dame burned down, of course, but this coexistence, or I lived on the Upper West Side in New York to hear the bells of St. John, and I live near a church right now, and I hear that, though they tend to be they toll exactly noon, I would hear that, or at Fordham you would hear the bells. But this has always been this sort of coexistence between various sorts of timekeeping, and which ones you listen to depend on who you were. In fact, if you can think in a medieval city such as Paris, that there have been a whole bunch of churches, and there are a whole bunch of churches mentioned in terms of time work regulations, as well as later on, municipal clocks. Which ones do you listen to for your guild to tell you when to quit work, or for the university for that matter?
And this isn't in the notes, but I'm going to go ahead and spring this here. But there is some mention in On Time of sort of this eclectic coexistence of timekeeping in multicultural cities, particularly as colonization was doing its own thing with its own concepts and standards of time that are coordinated with something completely independent of the cultural values of the time and place that they were in. And I thought that was just a fascinating collection of concepts of observing time.
Yeah, and the imperialistic imposition of times, but also the fact that people had their own times, right? Their own native times, that you're living in, say, Beirut, and you've got the Christian missions clock-driven bells, you've got the Muezzin calling you to prayer, you've got a whole bunch you've got the various Christian sects that live in that city have their own time. There's a really great book which I cite. I'm trying to find where it is. It's in the book. I cite it. Someone did a really great study of that and the correlation between imperialism. Vanessa Ogle, Global Transformation of Time. Yeah, so it's really covered very well in Vanessa Ogle's The Globalization of Time. She's a very good historian. I really recommend people check out that book.
I was actually reminded during that conversation a little bit about there's an episode of Babylon 5 in which the Narn ambassador Jakar is all concerned about being able to participate in a particular very important religious ritual in his culture. And his rival ruins it for him by withholding an important ingredient for the ritual until the time has passed. And he says, I can't do it anymore. It's been ruined. I have not been able to follow my religion. The white savior in the episode comes up with a solution. He says, well, your planet is so many light years away from this space station. And so the light that was traveling from your star 70 odd years ago is just going to be reaching us in about 6 hours. So you can still celebrate your ritual under the same light as they were doing 70 or so years ago. And it reminded me of this. I was reminded of that during this conversation of all of these different ideas of time and timing devices coexisting in the same place.
Yeah, that was a great episode of Babylon 5 too. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But yeah.
And it's interesting because it also highlights something that was that actually was. I mean, I've studied theology. I mean, it's never it is never all encompassing, no matter what a first year theology student might think. But it is. There was so much that I wasn't aware of in terms of how important timekeeping was to the development of theology. Or there was such an intertwining of theology and time that I previously just was not aware of, particularly and especially the importance of celebrating Easter at exactly the right time, particularly when you're dealing with shifting calendars.
Yeah, and if you don't, right, that's heresy. So the whole Easter computer, that was a huge, huge thing for the early church, especially because you didn't want to be Judaizing. You didn't want to be keeping it at the same time as Passover. It plays a huge part in the early church, and also the self-definition of the Christian community. When do we keep this? When is this?
Can we talk a little?
Galileo.
Oh, go for it.
Yeah,
I'd love to talk about Galileo if we could.
Yeah, so one of the really cool things we know about Galileo and his overturning of the Aristotelian idea that a heavier object will fall faster, which is, of course, seems intuitive, but it's not true. And you can find a really, really great video of one of the Apollo astronauts dropping a feather and a hammer on the moon. And of course, they strike the moon's surface at the same time. But the Galileo, he did later drop cannonballs off the campanile of the Duomo of Pisa, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, as just a demonstration. But actually, he did most of his work on that rolling spheres down inclined planes of various weights, but the same circumference down inclined planes. And of course, he didn't have a stopwatch. Stopwatches were not invented till the 18th century. So he actually used the Aristotelian idea of tempo, of relative time, to measure that. And he did it by volume of water coming out of a water cloth, of a clepsydra. And so basically what he's doing is he's converting elapsed time to a measurable physical thing. And I think that, and which can be, of course, divided, et cetera, and multiplied and measured proportionately. And I think that is a really, really interesting way in which the roots of modern science were essentially medieval.
And that's one thing that had kind of, it caught me more by surprise than it should have. Because I'm used to, I would teach introduction to philosophy, so you have to reduce things, and I'm used to thinking in terms of, okay, here's some examples of medieval thinking. Here are some examples of Enlightenment thinking, and the idea of the kind of the further steps towards the Renaissance were fundamentally medieval. Was something that I found deliciously ironic.
Well, we don't even use the term Renaissance anymore. The Renaissance was just sort of a late medieval intellectual and artistic and philosophical movement in Italy, which romanticized the classical past. But there's really nothing really new about it. We like to use the term Renaissance. It evokes a lot of things. It's very evocative, but we really in the discipline, we tend to use the term early modern more. But of course, exactly when we pass from the medieval to the early modern is a very, very fuzzy thing. I like to use the 16th century or, what date. But in many ways, periodization is just a way that history departments, decide to make hires and organize their syllabi. So, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I kind of had my own encounter with that when I made it was a little bit of a silly decision, but it was my decision to read all of my Italian fencing manuals and read them in chronological order. And it was like, wow, in retrospect, now that I'm actually reading this, that was super arbitrary because these are all informed by so many different developmental things and not just all in a nice tidy row.
Yeah, and fencing masters may have been patronized by educated people, and they may have been dealing with educated people. This is actually very, very interesting to the development of science because fencing masters were sort of craft masters. They weren't necessarily the most intellectual guys, but they were certainly dealing with a population that was intellectually trained and wanted theorization of time and theorization of fencing, and in many ways they contribute to the scientific revolution with something called the Zissel thesis, which I handle in the book. But it's I'd really like to do a monograph on fencing treatises in general, and handle the sort of the way in which fencing treatises are an aspect of the mentality that led to the growth of modern science and the birth of modern science.
One of the things that I kind of become aware of is, and maybe a little bit before I had read the book, but just our Western and particularly American obsession with time. And I think that's maybe something we should bring up for our listeners.
So our particular obsession with time is, I mean, it's very capitalist too, right? Very Calvinist and capitalist. We only have a certain amount of time. You need to use your time wisely to be prosperous. People in different cultures, people in pre-modern cultures had a very different sense of time. How long does it take to do something? Well, as long as it takes, right? I think it's Jean Buridan, the 14th century philosopher, says, well, we measure time in a whole bunch of ways. We can measure it by clocks, or workmen measure it by their work, by how much work they've done, and then they know it's time for lunch. In the clock, though, also changes understanding, right? That you have a quote from the book: the medieval clock tower regulated society communally by means of its signals, which it's true, right? That we see that medieval people, by their regulations, started regulating themselves by the tower clock, the public common tower clock. This is something that Gerard Dorn van Rossum discusses in his excellent History of the Hour, translated from the German by Thomas Dunlap. But that industrial capitalism expects its subjects to regulate themselves, right? That they have this pocket watch. Samuel Pepys has a pocket watch, and for him, it's this toy. Pepys was a diarist who lived, of course, in the 17th century, and wrote about life of Johnson and things like that. But he was also, because he's such a prolific diarist, we have his inner life. And he bought this not very accurate pocket watch, and this idea of it being a sublime toy, sort of like the iPhone of its age. But also this idea of a sense like that he's owning time, or he's carrying it in his pocket, but then also one is expected to regulate themselves by time. There's a regulator clock in the factory by which workers coming from usually a rural setting are expected to be productive, and we can compute productivity. Time times productivity per hour equals profits, right? But in turn, that it's supposed to be internalized. We're supposed to show up at certain places. And Americans were very, very concerned about being in the right place at the right time. Other cultures have a much looser sense of appointments and schedules, depending on the culture, of course. In Italy, things always started on Italian time, right? In Jewish liturgy, there are traditional liturgy. There are a bunch of prayers that you say basically to give time for everyone to show up for prayers, especially because you need a minyan, a quorum of traditionally 10 men, in order to say certain prayers. So what we do now is we regulate time, but that sense of internalized time has been really disrupted lately by the pandemic, because it used to be, okay, there was work time and then there was not work time. You go to work, you do your you did your 12 hours, but then of course, thanks to people like my great grandfather and unions and stuff, it became 8 hours. And, this time is your own. Of course, then that bleeds out in late capitalism. Oh, well, you got to do overtime. You got to do work time. If you're hourly, you get paid overtime. But then salaried people, oh, you're just expected as a matter of course to work late because that's what you're getting paid to do. And, it's got to get done. And of course, productivity, do more with less and things like that. And now with COVID, this division between private time and work time, that is time that's leased out, has become completely dissolved, because instead of being in a separate location where we're on the clock, as it were, the clock is now in our houses. That the panoptic eye of labor of the school mistress too, right? Don't forget kids on Zoom, right? That, got to have your cameras on and looking and being attentive and all that. It's invading the home, right? So it's not like we've gone back to the sort of pre-industrial way of doing things because of the pandemic. If anything, the factory has imposed its time discipline on our personal lives and on our homes.
I feel like I've been pretty lucky in that regard, because Of course, there hasn't been enough work for me to do. It's been to the point where now, instead of having to sit at my desk, and wait for 5 o'clock to come by, whether or not I have work to do, when I'm done with what I've been assigned, I can just say, okay, I'm done, and I'm close my chat window, and I'm done for the day.
Yeah.
But I know that there's a lot of people that are working, 15, 16 hours now on jobs that they used to work only 8 hours, just because their employment has come into their home, and they're having a hard time separating those two things from each other.
Not to mention taking care of their kids and stuff, right?
Right. And all of that's bleeding together. And I know a few of my friends have been having a hard time separating their times. Like, this is work time, this is kid time, this is homemaking time, and I can't get all of this stuff done because all of them are demanding all of my time now. So I feel like I've been pretty lucky in that regard.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, a lot of people, including yours truly, are kind of at their wits' end. I've always been sort of working for myself, but, being back in school, when you're in school, all time is school time, right? But
right.
Yeah. And a lot of jobs, it's just overwhelming. So
it's actually interesting because when I was leaving teaching as my primary profession, I was specifically looking for a place where I was not working at home. Like, I wanted an office to go to because I had found that I had just dissolved all of those boundaries. And how much time do you spend teaching? Well, you can pour in as much of yourself as you want, and even more than you want, trying to pour yourself into a class or into a course or into a structure or into teaching material. And so it's interesting that things are kind of rebounding into similar space and trying to reestablish certain boundaries is an interesting thing in COVID times.
Yeah. For myself, I teach my fencing classes still, of course. And that, that's something that I can prep for as much as I want to, or as little as I want to, because of course I also have my own, I have all these teaching materials and trying to come up with distance learning courses and videos and things like that. But at the same time, that's kind of a passion. But thinking to when I was adjunct teaching and how little I was paid and how little my time was worth. And I said to myself, is this really what I am worth? Because, your time is worth what the market says it is. And I said, I'm not doing this anymore. And what I really want is a job where it's a little more defined, and also where I've got security, because the casualization of labor in academia is another thing. Mm-hmm. But and I think at a certain point we do reach the level of burnout, but also that's also that we're, this is also a critique of capitalism, that we're cogs in a machine. And I'm not saying that, I'm a socialist, but I'm saying that I think that even somebody who's got a Donald Trump bumper sticker and who says that they are vehemently anti-socialism is going to agree with me that there needs to be reasonable remuneration for reasonable labor, and that people cannot be used up and thrown away like Willy Loman in Death of a Salesman, who of course got his gold watch for his retirement, right? A bit of symbolism there. So yeah, that's my spiel about that.
I've always thought that this idea that some employers have of we're going to squeeze everything that we can get out of our employees is self-defeating, because it's proven that makes productivity less. It's like hiring one more person would make everybody happier and more efficient and cheaper because you're not having to pay overtime. But especially in the VFX industry, that just doesn't seem to compute with people. They would rather work everybody 16 hours than hire another person to fix the problem.
Well, it's two different things. One, of course, is that you can, in certain industries, especially ones that are, a lot of people want to get into, or where there's especially if it's both desirable and there's a shortage of like really good people, as in VFX. Mm-hmm. But also where there's another, there's always another, sometimes it's that there's always another college graduate who can do as good a job or better lined up there. which is coding, right?
Well, they think that.
Yeah.
They think that,
Well,
but
they
that
think
college graduate cannot do as good a job as or better. They're cheaper.
We've seen that VFX movie.
Well, remember also that, companies are run by management, and management did not major in humanities; they majored in business, which means they're idiots. So they
or even worse, VFX companies are being run by artists who don't have a single clue about business or management.
Yeah. But then the other thing, I suffered. You should too. But you're gonna suffer for it. But the other thing too, companies and management, they go through phases. Like Ibn Khaldun said in the Muqaddimah back in the 14th century that you got the lean mean startup, which are it's the Arab peoples freshly emerged from Arabia. They've conquered the Persian Empire. Then the next generation is kind of a little more settled, and they begin to avail themselves of the bureaucracies and the systems that the Persians had set up for centuries and millennia. And then the third generation starts getting decadent, and then the fourth generation is just there because they have a hydraulic despotism on the resources the society needs to survive. So part of it is that we do live, I think, in talking about conceptions of history. I think we're definitely living in a time where we've got feet of clay, and that there's a sort of narrative of decline or a cyclical. If you want to look at Spengler and Spengler's idea of time and his decline of Western civilization, I think there's definitely something to it, and that we are living in in the United States, at least, in a declining civilization. This is our time of decline that we really need to look at, say, how Europe dealt with their decline, right? How did they, because they settled quite comfortably after the decline into kind of a cozy, a sort of coziness. And I think that we need, as the United States, to reckon with the fact that we can't be such achievers anymore, and we need to, it's just not going to work. We can't, because Apollo 11 was our Great Pyramid of Giza, and we just kind of need to settle quietly into our senescence and create mechanisms for ourselves to live. Right? We need, we're over our adolescence. We're over our young adulthood. We need to kind of settle into something quiet, if that makes sense. I really do have the feeling that we live in a civilization decline, though. So maybe it's just because I'm in academia.
I having worked in academia, I understand. I definitely having left the teaching portion of academia and still working in it. Yeah.
You're teaching philosophy and theology, right?
I was teaching predominantly philosophy and ethics, and I was very happy to be teaching at the community college level in terms of being able to engage these bright, new, wonderful people who were discovering many things for the first time and fighting about them with me in class, which was always a lot of fun. But, it's funny because being an adjunct, I found that I also loved something more than teaching, and that was being able to eat.
Yeah.
So
that's why I'm doing a master's in education. Yeah, I feel you. Yeah. At least your students were engaged and supposed to apathetic, because, a lot of people, the problem with teaching Western civilization is that a lot of people just don't identify with it anymore. And I think a lot of people never did, really. It just seems very remote and far away. That we do need, I think, a different curriculum. And I do want to do an open educational resource that makes the Middle Ages seem relevant to today's people, today's learners, that things that make sense to people who come from a very different background than you and I do. So, because that's the only way the field's going to survive. Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting because these things are fundamentally relevant. We just don't connect to it. I had zero appreciation for how these problems of the age of sail were combined together with the theories of general relativity that made it possible for me to drop my friend off at her house last night because I have a GPS, which are as you describe in the book, are nothing more than timekeeping devices that have built into their programming the effects of gravity for general relativity.
Yeah. Well, I mean, true GPSs, I mean, if we're using our phones, they're usually going off the local, they're usually triangulating between cell towers. But yeah, the true GPSs, if you're like, out in the middle of nowhere. Yeah. But yeah, it is, we live in a world that's blessed in some ways, but it's that the rate of change keeps accelerating. And I think it leaves some people very bewildered and very, very uncomfortable too.
Well, I think we're pretty close to the end of this conversation.
Yeah. Should I plug my pluggings?
Yes, I was just about to ask if you had anything that you'd like to draw the audience's attention to.
Yeah, my plugins of Plugginess. Well, my website is kenmondschein.com. And my historical fencing school, if you're in New England, we call ourselves Massachusetts Historical Swordsmanship, and the website is mhswords.com. And you'll notice that I have a distance learning thing there with video and Zoom classes. I'm trying to get my curriculum up online. There's a link on the website to actually a Patreon. So if you want to access to these remote learning things I'm doing. And right now it's baton and rapier, longsword to come, plus one experiment with remote coaching. Then I invite you to check it out. And even if you are in a HEMA school or you don't need instruction or you're not interested in the videos, I've got links to all my books and a whole bunch of writings and interesting academic writings on historical fencing, etc. And of course, on time, on my website. So if you're interested in that or in my other books like Game of Thrones and the Medieval Art of War, or my translation of Camillo Agrippa, or my rapier treatise, or my modern guide to learning rapier, or my modern guide to learning two-handed sword, I invite you to check that out. And you can also email me through a form there. So yeah, please enjoy.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Cool. So thank you guys very, very much. This has been a lot of fun.
I've had a blast. It's wonderful having you here.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose that would take us to our zombie apocalypse strategy of the week. And our special guest has a strategy for us this time. Ken, what do we have to survive the hordes?
Patience. If the past year or so has taught us anything, it's that the apocalypse is very, very slow moving and kind of dull and boring. So I think that most of what we're going to do is just kind of wait for them to rot. I mean, eventually, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, they're going to freeze and that's going to happen. But if you think about zombies, right, they're just dead people and they probably don't have, much to resist the rotting. So if you just think about it, before too long, there's just going to be, pieces of them lying around unless they keep reinfecting people. Probably be a rather slow-moving apocalypse, come to think of it. So that's what I counsel you. The key to surviving the zombie apocalypse, board games. You'll need a lot of them.
Easy sell here.
Let's play some Last Night on Earth, some zombies.
Settlers of Catan, yeah.
I just unboxed some Star Wars miniatures with my youngest, so I think we're good.
So that wraps it up for another episode of Geek at Arms. And as usual, we're going to ask you to be blessed, be safe, and be geeky. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Geek at Arms. Music for this podcast was provided by Incompetech.com. For more, check us out at Facebook.com/Geek at Arms. Give us a like and maybe even subscribe to us on iTunes. That would be awesome.